All right, folks, welcome on behalf of our Student Center for the Public Trust chapters at UNM and MSU. We are proud to have our first speaker for the academic year on the Business Ethics series, Dr. Vanessa Hill. Before formally introducing her, so a few housekeeping items and acknowledgements. So my name is Wellington Spedic. I'm a faculty here at Anderson School of Management. I'm the advisor for our SCPT chapter here at UNM and the co-campus leader of our Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. My partner in crime, the other campus leader, is Dr. Sean Berman, and with his cat. I'd like to acknowledge Lauren Martinez. She's the graduate student and president of the SCPT and really the force behind organizing this event. Crystal Rose, I'd like to acknowledge her also. She's the graduate assistant for the the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative here at UNM. And Dr. Erin, Blaungrand, is it somewhat correct?
Close enough.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. And Erin is the campus leader of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative at New Mexico State. So with that, as always, I'd like you to keep your audios off, so mute yourselves. You can keep your videos on or off, doesn't matter, unless we have connection issues, but so far so good. But just be aware that your video is on, okay? So sometimes it's on, you don't know, so make sure you know it's on, and and so it doesn't matter, either or on or off. Laura and I, so we'll be looking at chat, and if somebody raised their hands, so feel free to participate. We're planning this for 40 minutes and leave the rest for questions and comments, and we have the full hour. So without further ado, I would like to formally introduce Dr. Vanessa Hill from the College of Business Administration at University of Louisiana, Lafayette. I think I got that right. It's a lot of French language. Dr. Hill currently teaches business ethics, human resource management, and leadership courses, and her research interests include business ethics, leadership, workplace values, and CSR. Her work has been published in several scholarly academic journals, including Business and Society Review, Journal of Business Ethics, and the Journal of Management Inquiry. She's also an associate editor for Business and Society Review and serves on the editorial review boards for the Journals of Business and Society and the Journal of Business Ethics. That's a very short summary again, sorry, Vanessa, but feel free to add to that. So welcome, and thank you very much for speaking with us today. Take it away.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Wellington. I think that's just the perfect amount of information about me for now. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you all for sharing part of your Friday afternoon with me. So what I'd like to do first is just share my screen with you, and then I'd like to get an idea of who's out there. I see a bunch of black boxes. Some of you that are courageous enough to turn on your cameras, thank you. But I'd like to get a better picture of who all of you are. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to start off. You should be able to see my screen now, and I will start slide presentation. And I'll start off with a poll. Wellington and Lauren told me a little bit about who the audience is, but just for me to get an idea of who's joined me this afternoon. So I'll start off with the first poll. Which category best describes you? Are you an undergraduate, graduate student, or faculty member? Okay. All right, fantastic. So I'm speaking to a mix of undergraduate and graduate students with a couple of my colleagues sprinkled in there. Thank you all for joining again, and that helps me out a little bit. And then I'll have to ask another question that I have for you is, what motivated you the most? Not that I'm sure you were motivated by all of these, but what motivated you the most to attend today's presentation? Okay, well, thank you for your honesty. Most of you are here to receive the extra credit. I'm impressed that the second place is a profound interest in business ethics. I find that to be impressive. And Lauren, cool description on the flyer. You got some love there for the cool description on the flyer. And you have dedicated SCPT members. So thank you for that. That is very helpful to know. So I want this to be a session that works well for all of you. So if you have questions while I'm presenting, go ahead and submit those questions in the chat as they mentioned before, and I will do my best to stop what I'm doing and to pick up on a question that's being asked. So I'm looking forward to sharing some observations that I've had about my challenges in making ethics stick beyond the course work, and I hope that it will provoke a good discussion, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this. All right, so here we go. What I'd like to talk to all of you about today is the following. First, I want to start off with describing what transfer of training is and what I mean by that, and why I decided that that was the topic of today's discussion. The second is I'd like to go into the 3 factors that we have found in research that affect the transfer of training. And that's training design, which I'll spend most of my time talking about, student readiness, and finally, work environment. Hopefully by this point in the presentation, I will have provided enough food for thought for you guys to participate in a discussion with me at the end about what we can do to make ethics stick beyond the coursework. So that's my overall game plan for this session. So first, why am I talking about transfer of training? So one of the insights that I had after graduate school was that graduate school prepared me to teach scholarship rather than practice. So in graduate school, it's an apprenticeship program essentially to teach you how to become a researcher and a scholar. And what I'm really well equipped to do after graduate school, just coming out of graduate school, was to teach the performance of theory. And what I mean by that is that I was evaluated by the degree to which I could show that I understood the theoretical models that were being presented, the abstract concepts that were being presented. I had to demonstrate that I could develop a design then to investigate those models, either to confirm those models or to challenge those models or to substitute those models with something better. But what I really realized after a couple semesters teaching was that the performance of theory may not result in ethical professional behavior. Basically, when I'm teaching ethics classes, my goal isn't to teach the students necessarily how to become ethics researchers. If there's some students that are motivated to go into a PhD program or motivated to be ethical scholars, fantastic. So excited about that. But the majority of my students aren't looking to do that. What they're trying to do, one, to be pragmatic, they're trying to meet the requirements for their degree. But on another level, I thought it would be really neat if I could have some kind of assurance that they're taking anything that I've exposed them to in class and applied it in their professional lives. So that's why I'm interested in transfer of training. I'm interested in trying to understand what I can do to make the concepts we cover in class be accessible to students when they leave the class. So transfer of training, let me back up a bit and explain what I mean by that. What I mean by transfer of training is I borrowed the concept from human resource management. In HR, there is a concern that many companies have about whether or not their training actually realizes a return on investment. It costs companies a significant amount of money to provide the training. The companies have to give people the time possibly away from their work for the training, as well as they have to pay the facilitator, and that could be quite costly. So HR specialists are concerned about whether or not the training that they have paid for or invested in really realizes their return on investment. So the concept transfer of training in the HR context is training that produces a permanent, observable change in the thought and behavior, resulting in effective job performance. The way that I've modified it or adapted it to what I'm thinking about as an educator is training that produces permanent, observable changes in thought and behavior, resulting in ethical professional behavior. As I tell my students, investing in these classes is an investment in my future. I believe strongly that I am preparing the next generation of leaders, not just in industry, but across all of our other institutions, whether they be nonprofit or government agencies. And I would really like to have good people in these positions that are attempting to figure out the right thing to do based on some kind of principles. So that's how I became interested in transfer of training, and why I thought it would be an interesting topic to talk to all of you about and to share some of my observations about what I've seen as the challenges of making ethics stick beyond the classroom. So the transfer of training model that's used in HR to talk about training of employees, I've modified to be applicable to the coursework. So first, in the transfer of training process, we have training inputs. These are the factors that are thought to have the biggest impact on whether or not employees take what they've learned in the training and apply it to the workplace. So if I'm modifying it for the classroom, these are the inputs that should be the most important in making sure that what I'm exposing you to in the classroom is then applied later on in the workplace. So there's 3 inputs: student readiness, course design, and work environment. If those factors are positive, it should result in training outputs and learning and retention. And hopefully this learning and retention results in some desirable outcomes. In my case, what I would love to see is that my students are able to apply ethical reasoning in their professional lives, and that this results in the development of ethical leaders that promote sustainable business practices. So those are the things that I aspire to when I'm designing my courses. Going back to the training inputs, in this model, there's only one of the 3 training inputs that I can directly impact, and that's course design. I can't screen my students and choose the students that I have in my class. I wouldn't want to do that, but I can't do that either way. And the work environment, I would love to be able to have more impact on the work environments of my students, but realistically, I have limited capacity to control what you guys encounter in the workplace. So the only thing that I can really directly control or influence is the course design, which is what I'm going to spend most of my time sharing with you, what I've done in my courses, and then what I've observed in those courses in terms of effectiveness and hopefully making some of these concepts stick. So there are 3 design factors that are thought to really impact effective transfer of training. I teach 2 courses that are specifically related to corporate social responsibility or business ethics. One course that I teach is the professional ethics requirement for all business majors, and it's called ethical decision making. The second course that I teach is an elective that generally juniors or seniors take, and it's business and society. The difference between the 2 courses is the professional ethics course focuses primarily on business ethics, and the business and society course focuses primarily on how businesses manage the relationships between various stakeholders and how they do so in a socially responsible way, hopefully. So the 3 design factors that I try to take into consideration when I'm designing a course. One is behavioral modeling, the second is error management, and the third is realistic training environment. So behavioral modeling. Behavioral modeling, what you do is you clearly define expectations for behavior. You present ideal models of that desired behavior. You then provide opportunities to practice the new behavior, and then you provide feedback for the students. So I have elements of behavioral modeling in both of those classes. With lectures, I try very hard to identify examples of good execution of the principle that I'm trying to teach in class. Generally, current events are a very good pool of examples that I can draw from about leaders that are addressing emerging issues well, and then also how they don't do such a good job in addressing those examples. And that works well for me too, especially when I work on error management. So I go through the process where I clearly define the expectations. I provide the rubrics that I use to evaluate the assignments at the beginning of the semester. They're in the syllabus. And through lectures and discussions, I try to present ideal models of the desired behavior. I always try to have at least 2 assignments so that they could get feedback from the first assignment and then use that for the second assignment. I wish I could do more, but depending on my class size, I may or may not be able to do that at the individual level. And then I always give some feedback that they can use to incorporate. My course activities, there'll be 2 that I'm going to focus on throughout the rest of the discussion. In my Management 400 class in Business and Society, I have debates where I have the students, I assign the students a position, pro or con a statement. The statement is usually a reflection of an emerging business issue or a controversy that's happening in this business space. The second assignment that I'll spend some time talking about is for my ethical decision-making class, and it's what I call a press conference role play. In this particular assignment, students are given the role to be a spokesperson for an organization or stakeholder group that's involved in an emergency, in a business emergency. And they have to prepare a statement that explains what the stakeholder group is doing, what the stakeholders' role in the crisis is, and how they hope to remedy it. I'm going to go into more detail about each assignment after I get done going through the three different factors that contribute to transfer of training. So first is behavioral modeling. The second is error management. Error management acknowledges that when you're trying a new concept for the first time, you're probably going to make mistakes. And so it anticipates and allows the mistakes. And what it does is it provides instructions to the trainee or the student on how to correct for those mistakes. And this is the most constructive after the training has occurred. So in this case, perhaps after they execute the training, the assignment, I have multiple assignments and I'm able to give them that feedback. And I'm able also to provide examples through course discussion of leaders that didn't really execute a decision very well. And we discuss how they could have done things differently and discuss about what they should look out for in their own experience as they try to use these skills in their own working lives. So the activity that primarily makes use of this technique is the press conference role play. The final factor that in design that really helps with transfer of training is realistic training environment. And that's the idea that the environment in which you're teaching the person the new skill or the new behavior mirrors the environment that the new skills will be used. So the disadvantage that I have is that this isn't on-the-job training. There's only so much I can do to simulate what will happen to all of you in the workplace. So what I try to do is I try to create in the press conference role play a scenario where you have to be the spokesperson of a stakeholder group. What I tell the students is that while I don't know what they'll end up doing for a living or even the level of the organization they'll be in, what I do know is there is going to be a particular point in their career where they're going to have to explain a decision that was made by their organization, by their department, or even one that they're solely responsible for. And so this is an opportunity to practice how you communicate the criteria you use to make the decision and how you justified that decision. So those are the three different factors that are thought to influence transfer of training from a course design perspective. I want to go into a little bit more detail now about the specific assignments. So debates. As I mentioned before, in my business and society class, I assign debate topics, and I assign a group of students to argue pro and con the statements. So for example, 3 resolutions we've debated this semester. Of course, there's a classic one that happens at the beginning of an ethics course or the beginning of a business and society course, where you're trying to establish why corporate social responsibility is important. So the exclusive purpose of business is to make profits. And we read Milton Friedman's essay about the social responsibility of business is to make profits. And so the first resolution is debating that statement. There are students assigned pro and con resolution. Other topics, for example, is business influence on government is a threat to democracy. So when we talk about business and government relations, that'll be the topic that we debate. We talk about how business uses its resources to influence legislators. And so this will be part of the debate that we talk about for that unit. And recently we talked about ethics and technology. And so we debated whether or not companies should be required to audit their algorithms for fairness and accuracy. So the logic behind this assignment is a couple of things. One, there are going to be situations in which, as professionals, you're going to work with folks who don't see eye to eye with how you would like to proceed on a major decision. How are you going to talk about these difficult issues? In the debates, we use Robert's Rule of Order. I don't think that you'll use parliamentary procedure when you're out there in the workplace, but what I am trying to do is to develop skills in how to have constructive disagreement. And I'm also trying to help you understand how the concepts that we are covering in class can be used as a basis for you to advance your ideas about why the organization should adopt your plan and how that plan results in responsible business practices. So that is the logic of the assignment. The task, as I mentioned, is that students are assigned to present arguments supporting or challenging the statement related to an emerging issue. Here's how they're evaluated. 1, are the arguments presented relevant to the assigned topic? 2, are the arguments consistent with the assigned position? Are the arguments supported by verifiable data and facts? Notice I didn't put truth. Truth has become a loaded word these days, but what I have done is said, look, if you're going to provide information, it should be verifiable, and so that we can confirm its validity. 3, the position reflects ethical reasoning. 4, it clearly states the position. And finally, do the arguments logically flow from each other? So here's what I'm thinking of when I come up with these criteria. Oftentimes when we're trying to argue against a perspective we don't agree with, we do a disservice and we don't really argue in good faith because we misrepresent what the opposing point of view is. We either make the opposing point of view seem so outlandish and so absurd that it doesn't really make any sense why anybody would have that different perspective in the first place. Doing that is a disservice. It's not only a disservice to the other person who holds that perspective, but it's a little dishonest. So what I'm trying to get them to do is to have disagreements with integrity, to understand that a differing perspective, but not necessarily having to adopt it. So let me give you an example of when this was relevant for me this semester. One of our debate topics was the statement read, resolved, subsidies, government subsidies should be redirected from fossil fuels to renewable fuel industries. One of the students that I assigned to speak in favor of that, such that subsidies should be given to renewable resources, didn't agree with that statement. And so what he decided to do instead is he argued that subsidies should be redirected from fossil fuels to nuclear sources of energy. And so he intentionally misinterpreted the statement so that he wouldn't have to engage with a point of view that he didn't agree with. And so that is why I have some of those controls in there. We want to make sure that people are discussing differences in opinion with integrity and that they are being honest and respectful of multiple points of view. And at the same time, you learn something about your own point of view when you have to develop some empathy with a different perspective. So not only do I use the rubric to try to encourage performance, but the stakes for the debates are quite high. So after the debates, I have the students vote on two questions. One, do they support or do they reject the resolution? And the second one, which speaker influenced their thinking the most during the debate? The winner of that poll gets quite the prize. They get a Funko bobblehead. And every semester it's a new theme. So this semester, the theme is pop icons. And one of my students did win this for exemplary speech skills, for being very persuasive in the debate. So that is my assignment for the for Management 400, which is my Business and Society course. So I have rubrics. And this talk was an excellent opportunity for me to actually get to analyze all the data I've been collecting over multiple semesters about students' performance on these rubrics. So what you see right here is the quick and dirty analysis of the average rating. The rating is from 1 to 10 on each of those performance dimensions. There were 159 students in this sample, and they were taking my Business and Society course from between 2016 and 2019. The good news is, on average, all scores increased from time 1 to time 2, even if just slightly. The discouraging news for me as their instructor was, as you can see, ethical reasoning was the dimension they scored the lowest, which meant that they failed to connect their arguments or base their arguments or justify their arguments on some sort of ethical approach, ethical reasoning that we had studied in class. That seemed to be very difficult for them to transfer training. Also, verifiable data seemed to be a bit more of a challenge than the other dimensions, but they still managed on average to score at least 8 or above. So that is the results from the first debate, knowing that, or from my analysis of the debates up to this point, knowing that ethical reasoning is still a difficult thing to get students to apply to concepts, to situations beyond a hypothetical class assignment. So the second assignment is a press conference role play. And in that assignment, my logic is this. As I mentioned before, there's going to be some time in your careers where you're going to have to explain a decision to multiple constituencies. What I'm trying to do is to develop skills where you can communicate the decision transparently, you will take responsibility for the decision and its consequences, and you develop a plan of action to address the problems, considering your stakeholders and applying ethical reasoning. So as an example, one of the cases that I assigned was the opioid epidemic, and students were assigned to be spokespeople for the major pharmaceutical companies that were found to have a major influence in the distribution of opioids. So each student was, so the students were assigned to represent a pharmaceutical company, and one student was assigned to represent the FDA. And their task was to develop a statement, a public statement that explains to the public what happened, what their group's role in the situation was, and plans to address the problem. So the criteria was that they needed to explain the events that led up to the crisis, including their organization's role in those events, what the course of action they proposed to take. Does the course of action demonstrate a basis in ethical reasoning? Is the course of action mission or vision based? This is a nod to virtue ethics and having mission driven or value driven decisions being made. Does the course of action address stakeholder concerns? And this is one that I added. Does the response express empathy? What I found is that a lot of leaders are quick to apologize and say, we're very sorry for this event happening, but it's not clear that they fully understand or appreciate the impact of their actions on the affected parties. So I was looking to try to see how well students could express empathy and to demonstrate that they really understood the consequence of their stakeholders' behavior on other interested parties. So press conference role play. Here we have performance the first time they are asked to represent a stakeholder group. Here we have a little bit more trouble with some of the skills. This class happens earlier in their career than the Management 400 class with the debates. So I'm not surprised to see that. It's a little bit earlier in their training. But the dimensions that give them the most problem is ethical reasoning, demonstrating a connection between their proposed course of action and the mission, the core values of the organization, and the ability to address stakeholder concerns and expressions of empathy. We do see improvement in performance at time 2, the second time that they are asked to do a press conference role play. One semester I got ambitious and I said, well, if performance improves after assigning it 2 times, what happens if I assigned it 4 times? That was ambitious and resulted in some interesting outcomes. So here are some the trends that I found to be most intriguing. It doesn't, 4 times seems to be a bit too much. The 3rd time is the charm. The 3rd time here, it's this color right here. Notice on most dimensions, the 3rd time is the highest level of performance across most of the dimensions, except for, let's see, except for ethical reasoning. For some reason, it was best at the 4th time, which is what I'm hoping to see. But across all the other dimensions, empathy, stakeholders, mission-based, ethical reasoning, explains course of action clearly, and explains the events leading up to it, time 3 seems to be the magic number. So perhaps I'll have an opportunity to try this again. This particular semester, the class size were manageable. I had 46 students in this sample. and they did 4 of these press conference role plays over the course of the semester. The improvements happened, the biggest improvements happened in their ability to explain the events that led to the crisis or dilemma. This shows some transparency. If the organization can clearly explain what happened and what their role in the situation was. They showed improvement for expressing empathy for the negative consequences of the actions. They were able to develop plans that better addressed the stakeholders' concerns, and they explained the course of action clearly. They weren't vague. They had outcomes that the listeners could concretely observe. So instead of saying, we'll do our best to address the situations, we feel your pain and we are working on it, they are very clear initiatives that the stakeholder would take. One question that frequently comes up in this exercise is one mistake that was made initially was that the students would repeat the ethically questionable behavior of the stakeholder group they were representing because they thought that what they were supposed to do was to represent what that stakeholder had done. What I tell them is that they are fixers. If the stakeholder group that you're representing engaged in ethically questionable approaches to responding to the crisis, you should fix it. You definitely don't want to repeat what they did. Ideally, if you could fix what they've done, what would that look like? So I was encouraged to see that there does seem to be improvement over trials, and that it seems like what I did learn is that 3 times seems to be the charm. I think it may be because the 4th time may be towards the end of the semester. Could be competing pressures. There could be fatigue. So this is not a scientific study. This is a convenient sample, of course, and I'm the only rater. So it would be interesting to see, if I had other people that could rate the students' performance on this, would I get the same thing? But for my curiosity's sake, I was just really curious to see how students did over time. And I had that data available, so I thought it would be a really cool analysis to do. So those are the 3 dimensions related to course design that I can directly control. This is how I've used it in my class, and these are the results that I've seen so far. So there's 2 other factors that I can't directly control as an instructor. And these factors are student readiness and work environment. So student readiness as it relates to transfer of training is cognitive ability, the student's ability to learn, the belief in their ability to successfully master the skills taught, or in geek terms, self-efficacy, motivation, their drive to continue with the training and to learn what the training will provide. And even that they'll be excited about doing this even when the task becomes difficult. So it's drive, effort, and persistence. Perceived usefulness of business ethics is another factor that's related to student readiness. So I had you take that poll at the beginning of the session, asking you what your primary motivation for attending the session is. Ideally, if you're highly motivated and you perceive the usefulness of this session, extra credit would not have been your answer for attending the session. Attending the session would have been because of a profound interest in business ethics. So just to say, these are factors that I can't directly control as an instructor. I have some ideas about what the challenges are to student readiness are. I don't have any doubt in the ability of my students. I think the students are fully capable. You guys come with everything you need to be able to learn. But I do see some trends in general that may provide a little roadblock in being as ready for studying business ethics as I would hope. One insight is reading is fundamental. I've noticed over the years that students report to me that they like reading less and less. When I first started this career, people would tell me they don't like math. But now I'm having people tell me that they don't like to read. And I've known intuitively that reading is important. And reading is fundamental used to be a public service program that was done to increase literacy. But what I found digging a little bit deeper is how important reading is and why. Researchers identify the following benefits from reading fiction. They've identified that people who read fiction have better social skills. They develop empathy because they get involved in the story and they become invested in the characters and they can appreciate their perspectives. In this manner, reading fiction expands our ability to understand other points of view and increases our capacity for empathy. Also, reading fiction enlarges our imagination about what's possible, so that could contribute to people's moral imagination. It provides motivation for making positive life changes. It increases people's ability to learn and increases their cognitive ability. And I think that these factors contribute to student readiness for transfer of training. I think it contributes to cognitive ability. I think it contributes to motivation and also being able to understand other perspectives. Certainly, I think enhances perceived usefulness of business ethics. So looking a little bit deeper, I found that researchers estimate that students in your demographic spend about 7.72 hours a week doing reading related to school. They spend 8.95 hours per week on the internet and 4.24 hours per week on reading for pleasure. I think the internet use is a rather conservative estimate. I think if you factored in social media, that average amount of time per week spent on internet use would be quite a bit higher. So one, I think our reading habits have impacted student readiness. The second trend that I think impacts student readiness, I was influenced by this essay that was written about 6 years ago. It was written in 2015 by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. And it was an essay written for the Atlantic Monthly, and it was called The Coddling of the American Mind. In that essay, Lukianoff and Haidt warn that universities are infantilizing college students by shielding them from exposure to ideas and experiences that offend them. They argue that universities are creating a climate that fosters sensibilities to possible offenses and has gone overboard in doing so, and it results in a student body that they claim is psychologically fragile and intellectually rigid. While I don't agree with all of the arguments in this essay, that observation made me think. Ethical reasoning is a dynamic process where the individual is continuously seeking the best action to take through the application of ethical approaches, concepts, or models. What the right thing is to do is an open question. If people come to my class believing that their home training or their faith tradition or life experience has equipped them with all the information they need, then the usefulness of the professional ethics course is in question. And whether or not they'll be motivated to really dig in and learn from this course is already inhibited. So that could be a possible problem if these trends that Lukianoff and Haidt are observing are true. Also, ethically questionable situations in business often focus on controversial topics that reflect competing ideologies. If students can opt out of engaging in ideas that may make them feel uncomfortable, then how do I, as an instructor, fulfill my obligation to share what I know about techniques to deduce ethical responses to these challenges? It's hard to have that discussion. And finally, I think there's been a confounding among students about the difference between understanding a point of view and adopting a point of view. I've had students complain that they feel that they have to express a certain opinion in order to do well in an ethics class, because isn't it just about opinions anyway? And I use the following analogy. I use the analogy of going to a cooking school. You might not like a souffle. You might hate souffles, but you are responsible for learning how to make a souffle and make a souffle as it's intended to taste, how the texture is intended to be. That doesn't mean that after you're out of the culinary school that you have to put the souffle on the menu of your restaurant. You may never cook a souffle again, but you still have to understand, for the purposes of that culinary school experience, how to create that. And that, for me, is what these ideas are about. I have to hold you responsible for demonstrating that you understand the idea. Whether or not you adopt the idea is completely up to you. And sometimes I think in these discussions, students I've encountered have sometimes confused understanding versus wholesale adoption. Finally, work environment. That is another factor of transfer of training that I can't impact. So transfer climate is essential in ensuring transfer of training. And that means that the workplace encourages the use of your new skills, encourages the use, in this case, of ethical reasoning and the use of ethical principles. Looking at the state of ethics and compliance in the workplace, the news isn't so encouraging about a climate that encourages transfer. Only 21% of people working at US companies surveyed reported a strong ethical culture. A strong ethical culture would be one that would reinforce the skills that you're learning in a professional ethics or a class on social responsibility. Support. It's very important for supervisors to recognize, encourage, and reward the use of trained behaviors. Peer support, also very important. However, when we look at trends in the workplace, only 30% of people surveyed in US companies report increased pressure to do ethically questionable actions. 49% observe misconduct. 86% report misconduct, which is good news. But the bad news is that 79% of those reporting misconduct experience retaliation. Overall, this suggests that the work environment may not be supportive to the skills that you're learning in the classes, which is going to inhibit the transfer of training. Opportunity to perform the new skills is important, as well as follow-up, post-training feedback on performance of the new skills in the workplace. Oftentimes, employers don't directly talk about ethical issues in the workplace until something has gone wrong. It's not a part of their daily discussion. And so opportunities to perform these skills and follow-up may be difficult to come by. So in a nutshell, that is my observations. Those are my observations about attempting to make transfer of training stick when it comes to business ethics and corporate social responsibility. So here are my questions for you. How do we fix this? What should instructors do? And what can students do? So I believe I am right on time according to my timer, and I'm looking forward to opening the discussion for all of you about these topics.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Round of applause from a distance. I think we can just jump right into questions and comments. You can use the chat. You can just raise your hand. Laura and I will do our best to. So in my sequence here, Mark, unmute yourself and take it away.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the time and the interesting presentation, Dr. Hill. I just had a question based on you're saying that the work environment, of course, needs to support the new training, but is there potentially hypothetically assuming that the students eventually get into upper management type roles, is there like a time frame where that training is lost, or is it something that over time we'll see maybe a stronger move towards a more ethical business response?
Yeah, so can transfer training be lost? If I understand your question correctly, you're asking me, is there a specific statute of limitations on that training from the initial experience to when it needs to be implemented in the workplace in order to make it stick. What I understand of this concept is that the ideal situation is that as soon as possible, you start using that skill and the person sees that it's relevant as soon as possible after the training. Here's what I would tell my students is it may be a while before you're in a position to affect any change, but what I have observed is that you need to practice making those tough decisions and prioritizing ethics when the stakes are low, because it's only going to get more difficult as the stakes get higher. So if you can make those kinds of decisions when the cost is relatively low to you and you get to practice that, then by the time you're in a senior management position and the stakes are higher, it would be difficult, but I think you would be more likely to be able to do that because you've gotten positive results from doing that so many times before. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hill. It does. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Anybody else?
Vanessa, I have a question while people are thinking about questions, and obviously you can put your questions in the chat as well. So you can't control the work environment. I absolutely, agree with that, right? But what do you do, or what are your suggestions on helping your students find the right work environment? Because we can help with that, right, as instructors. So how do you help them find the right job?
Yeah, I think we can absolutely do that. I think we can impress upon them that being successful in a career is not only about getting a job, but getting a job at the right place. And that showing them in the long term, it may take them a little bit longer, in the short term, it may take them a little bit longer to find their fit. But in the long term, they can realize benefits. But as a university, I think there is something we could do to impact the work environment. And I think that perhaps this may be an opportunity for us to engage in more aggressive outreach to the companies, even though they don't necessarily ask for it, to kind of, where we can, say, here, why don't we have an event where we go through hypothetical situations where you bring in dilemmas that you've had in your workplace, and hypothetically we present it to a group and we brainstorm about how we would address it. And another school, my previous school, we had this event that was really cool, and it was a case where a business person would bring to a group of professionals from different companies a case, something that they had to deal with, an ethical dilemma. And then you would be tasked, all the people at the different tables would be tasked on how they should address it. And then they would come back together and give their suggestions, and then she would tell them what she did. And that was a really it was fun. It was over a meal and it was fun. It was kind of like a murder mystery, but for ethical problems. I think we can come up with creative programming for working managers. And I think that as a field, we should publish in outlets more that these people read. I love a good research paper as much as the next person, but that's not what the working manager is going to read. And they may not even read the Sloan Review or the Harvard Business Review. It may be having a column in the newspaper. It may be having a column. I'm seeing more and more academics publish opinion pieces in various news outlets. That might be a way to reach these folks a bit faster than we have in our traditional publication outlets. And maybe all those things combined with working on the students' selection activities with working professionals, we might be able to make a little bit of a difference.
I think Erin.
First, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I think it was amazing. And I'm thinking about, Zachary put a comment in about the role play scenarios, and I do a lot of those in my classes. And I really like this. And I'm thinking about the comment you made about students not liking to read. And I was just curious if you would be willing to share with us some of those role play scenarios, because I definitely know that our students at NMSU, and probably Sean and Wellington would agree, that UNM students also could really benefit from these type of role play situations, because that's where they learn how to kind of navigate things that they may encounter in the workplace, instead of those case analysis and things that we give them, which are all good and they're valuable. Yes. But at the same time, I just really appreciate your insight into these role plays.
I'd be happy to share it with you. And I have to disclose what I do. I love to read, right? So when a student told me they don't like to read, one time they told me this in class, I paused. I pretended like I was having a heart attack. And I was like, what? And I said, okay, you're hurting me now. This is cutting me to the core. But I have to take them where they are. So what I do is I find video clips. Maybe it's a 60-minute story, or maybe it's a news story. And I use that to present just the synopsis of the case. And then they have to go and do further research based upon who they were assigned to in that case. Because I've been disappointed in assigning cases and then coming to class all ready to discuss it. And the only people that have read the case are the people that actually have to produce something, right? And you can't really have a good discussion with people if they don't at least know the basic, the events happening in that case. So that's how I did. I'm happy to share how I present it and how I assign it to them. I'm happy to share that with you in the rubrics that I use.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Alice, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Spedick. Dr. Hill, I wanted to ask, going back to your question on how to improve ethics, like what we can do to improve ethics in the work environment. And I wonder if you have ever talked with your students around either initial interviews or exit interviews and how you can approach those topics in that space. Partly because I think it's a really great time for businesses to hear what prospective employees and potentially employees who are doing their exit interviews, what their main motivations for doing for their decisions are. And I was wondering if you talk about that, and if so, are there some questions that you would encourage all of us in this room to use in our next interview?
You know, I hadn't thought about that. I would probably see that in my HR, if I taught HR, and when I'm teaching them how to manage all parts of the employment relationship, but I hadn't thought about using that in my business and society or professional or the ethical decision-making class. I think that's an interesting opportunity to collect that information. I attended a seminar the other day on ghosting. And how applicants are ghosting the employers, and it was given by HR professionals. And of course, they're all in a tizzy, like, oh my gosh, they're ghosting us. And I was thinking as I was watching the presentation, well, they're just doing what you've done to them for many years in ghosting them on their application process. And lo and behold, before I could get that thought out, the HR professional said, most of these applicants, about 80% of applicants, reported being ghosted by the employer during that process. So the reason why I bring that in there is because I don't know how many organizations actually do exit interviews anymore. I'm not really sure if they are courageous enough to hear why people are leaving. I think it's an excellent idea, but I think about our experience with the university. Do they do exit interviews for people who decide to switch majors? Do we even do that for ourselves? So I think it's an interesting idea, and I have to consider how I can incorporate that possibly into a role play or possibly some kind of exercise where I give them the information that there are people that are leaving by the loads. What should they do about it?
I think we have time for one more, and I want to read this one from the chat, if that's okay. Just want to keep it respectful of everyone's time. So Jamie Malone who's my student, so good job, Jamie, is asking on the chat, Dr. Hill, you mentioned putting skills to use as soon as possible, but what specific suggestions do you have for students fresh out of college who may not have a lot of experience yet?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. So the not so hot news is that given this current climate, I think even people fresh out of school are going to experience ethically questionable situations much sooner in their career than they're expecting. I think that you're probably, if you've worked off campus, or even if you've worked on campus, you've already experienced ethically questionable situations. So it's about practicing those skills now. Because if it's scary for you now, imagine how much scarier it's going to be when you have, if you don't have already, mortgage, kids, all these other kinds of responsibilities. So what I would say for a person out of college is to reflect on what your core values are as a professional. What is your professional brand? What is it that you want to be known for professionally? What is the reputation you want to have? And then hold that very close to you and always refer to that when you're thinking about what someone's about to ask you to do, and trying to decide whether or not you want to do that, and go back to some of the things that we've covered in class, giving you tools to speak to that person. If they're asking you to do something that you're not comfortable with, giving you the tools to speak to them and kind of explain to them why that might not be such a good idea. So I would say you're going to begin to use them immediately. Whether you expect that or not, my hunch is you're going to use it much sooner than you would expect it. I hope that answers your question.
Well, we are 1:04 now. Vanessa, amazing. Wow, I always learn so much on these in these events. Thank you very much. Just a reminder for everybody, we're going to post the recording on our webpage in a few days. And yeah, thank you for changing a nice meal under the sunshine of New Mexico to being here with us today. We picked, I think, at 78 people at one point, so this is amazing. And for those with the SCPT, please stay around. If anybody has any final comment or thank you, I'll just like to, thank you again, and I'll be in touch soon.
Yes, thank you all for inviting me and for sharing your Friday afternoon with me. Have a good weekend.